Then the next step is transform it, right? What do you mean by that?
That's where we go into the grief and the gratitude. We learn to see grief as a mentor. We learn to be grateful for the lessons that it's teaching us. We learn through experiencing it, we learn, okay, now when grief comes again, I know, hello, grief. I've met you before. I know how my body reacts to you. I know what I need to express the grief, and I know that I can learn something from you.
Welcome to the Onward Podcast. I'm Emily Harmon, your host. The Onward Podcast features authentic conversations on facing adversity, moving forward, and discovering ourselves along the way. My guest today is Jenny Dilts. She's an advocate for balancing grief and gratitude, and she's passionate about helping people move forward with their grief so they can create a new normal for themselves. As a grief coach, Jenny accompanies people on their grief journeys and supports them in the process of converting their grief into stepping stones of growth. And Jenny recognizes that although grief is a universal part of the human experience, the journey itself is highly individualized and changes over time. So, as a grief coach, Jenny meets people where they are, and then she helps them explore where they'd like to be. And she collaborates with her clients to build a customized vehicle for getting them there. This Onward Podcast episode, like all of my recent Onward Podcast episodes, was first recorded live. And initially, Jenny had some issues getting into StreamYard, the app I use for broadcasting the stream live on LinkedIn. And so she was a little late to the meeting, and we weren't sure if she would be able to make it. And when she came in, I was like, Jenny! So you'll hear me greeting her, all excited to see that she made it into the show. And we talk about what Jenny has learned from grief. We talk about workshops that she hosts, compassion fatigue, burnout, and how Jenny is blossoming in ways that she never thought she would. Let's get to the interview.
Jenny, yay! You made it.
Talk
Okay,
about grief.
take a deep breath. You made it, and we're here. So I was
We are.
talking about grief just a little bit here, because I was sharing that my children's father passed away in December of 2019, right after I retired, and just still seeing my children grieve. He was my former husband, but my daughter was 23 and my son was 25 at the time. And just having them go through that was, I know, really, really tough. So I was looking at your website when tonight we're talking about balancing grief and gratitude. And I was looking at your website and it says that you have this steps on your website for converting grief to growth. And I wanted to ask you about that. But first off, why don't you just introduce yourself and we'll start from there. All right.
I'm Jenny Dilts, and I've been supporting people in grief for about 4 years. I've been a grief coach, meaning started actual coaching for 2 years. I have 5 kids, so if you see them in the background,
That's a lot.
that's also what I do. That's a big part of my life as well.
Yeah. Why did you get into grief coaching?
So I had the opportunity to support a friend when her husband died unexpectedly. And our kids were in the same class at school. And I had the opportunity to take a meal to them, to their family. And that experience taught me so much about one, what it's like to experience grief.
Mhm.
And I was able to put myself in her situation. I asked myself, what if my husband died suddenly? What would that look like for me? And in that process, I understood that I have a calming presence and people feel comfortable with me in sharing their trauma, their grief, their vulnerability, sometimes even so much that they don't share even with themselves. And that taught me a lot about myself, and it really sparked a passion for helping people in grief and for entering that space, that sacred space with people.
Yeah. What were you doing before that? Did you have a job outside the home or?
No, I have been doing being a mom. My
Yeah,
oldest is
that's
14,
yeah,
and so
busy enough.
I've been with home pretty
That
much since the kids have been born.
that's awesome. So I like your website because it talks about how you go on the journey with your client and you meet them where they are. Yeah.
And I find that that's essential because grief is different for everybody. It's not going to be, my grief is not going to be the same as yours.
Hmm.
And everybody has a different relationship, different experiences, different reactions to grief, different ways they process it. And who am I to say what somebody's grief has to look like?
Yeah. A lot of times we think, well, it's supposed to last a year, right? After a year, you're over it, and all those things that we hear. Do you help people with all kinds of grief, like also if they lose a pet?
I
Hmm.
do.
Yeah. And so you've got these steps, and the first one in your steps of going from converting grief into growth is recognizing grief. Why do you have that as a first step?
Because often when people think about grief, they think about only the grief when a close loved one dies. But like you were saying, grief can come from losing a pet. Grief can come from losing a job or trauma. Any change or loss in life can bring a grief response.
COVID.
Definitely the loss of community, loss of support, loss of normal living. And a lot of times people don't recognize those things as sources of grief.
Yeah. Are there typical inwardly feelings or even the way people act outwardly that would let someone know who maybe doesn't even realize that they're in grief that, well, maybe this is grief?
Yes and no. Because we're all individual, it's kind of hard to say that what I experience as grief, it may or may not be what somebody else experiences as grief. And
Right.
so if somebody's trying to match their cookie cutter into my shape, it may not fit very well. So that's why I say that grief is the natural response to a loss or change. And it's very individual. So we can't really fit it into like one size fits all because it
Yeah.
doesn't.
I mean, a lot of people try to do that though, right? They think
Yeah.
why is it that we think that that's possible or should be the way?
Probably because, well, I don't know for sure, but I have some ideas
Yeah.
that it's if it were all one shape for everybody, then it would be a whole lot easier to control, to understand, to manage, to expect, to plan for.
Yeah, and we like to be in control. No one likes to be out of control of things. You like to know what to expect. I expect that in 1 year, I'm gonna be perfectly normal again, whatever normal is, or fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, why did you wanna call this episode "Balancing Gratitude and Grief"?
Because I find that gratitude is part of grief. Grief is not just the sadness, the tears, the anger, the guilt. It's also the joy, the memories,
Mm,
the lessons that we've learned along the way, the times that we've shared, the precious relationships that we've built, the ways that we've grown because of our grief or from our grief or through our grief. And it takes both.
can you start to feel gratitude right away, or does that come later? Or is it different for everybody?
I think that's also different for everybody.
Yeah.
If you rush into the gratitude, then then you miss that vital step, that necessary step of feeling the grief.
Yeah. And I was saying when I got divorced from my children's father, I had to go to being a single parent, right? And I was working and didn't really know, I didn't really feel a lot anyway, I think, because the way my family was, it was more like in your head, less thinking. And then when I worked for the military, a lot was my focus was getting things done, being productive, right? And I didn't think about grieving because my story back then, and it's true, he was verbally abusive, but and that was my story, but that doesn't mean you don't grieve when you leave someone who's verbally abusive. And
Yeah.
I didn't really start feeling any of that until he passed away, any of that grief, which was like from 2002 when we got divorced to 2019. So I never really felt it all. And then it came on so quick. I was like, why am I grieving? We were divorced, but it's like a person that's gone and it's my kid's dad. And so it's good to have somebody like you to go through that with so that you don't feel alone.
And you bring up a good point that grief is not limited to somebody that you've loved.
Mhm.
Even if there are hurt feelings and trauma and not fun experiences, that can bring grief.
Mhm.
It's not just for those people that you love, it's for any loss of attachment.
That's a really good point. So how do you work with your clients? Is it in groups? Is it one-on-one?
I do most of my work in one on one, my
Mhm.
coaching, anyways, but I do a lot of grief education. And I do that in groups, like through workshops or podcasting, talking on other people's podcasts like I am with you, and
Mhm.
also hosting my own podcast.
Yeah, I saw you had your own podcast, and I also saw your page where I was saying before you came on, I like your page where it says, if you want to help, people can contribute some money because, I mean, publishing a podcast takes time and effort and money. And I usually do a couple of videos after this. There'll be like 3 videos probably highlighting some of the cool things that you were saying. And I don't do it myself. I contract that out. And so
Mm,
having people who listen support you means so much. And even if it's not financial support, even if it's just like someone messaged me today and told me that he listened to an episode I did a long time ago, because sometimes when you're doing your podcast, you're putting it out there, you really know who's listening, and it's so nice to know, wow, you listen to my podcast. You're shaking your head because you're sitting there talking in front of a microphone and you're like, I'm talking to you, but I don't know who I'm talking to. I can't see your face. I'm looking out the window and I feel like I'm just talking into this microphone and no one's listening when people do that. So even emotional support or writing a review on your podcast means a lot, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And like you said, you never know where this podcast is going to go, who's going to listen, what seeds it's going to plant.
Yeah. How it
It could be
impacted
like,
people. Yeah, and you wanna know because the reason you're podcasting is to help people, right? It's not,
exactly.
yeah, I mean, it helps you, but it's also to help others, and so when you get that feedback, it means so much. So tell us the name of your podcast and what you talk about.
So my podcast is Share Your Story, Exploring Humanity One Heart at a Time.
How long have you been doing it?
I started doing it in February, so I'm still very new.
Very new. How many episodes do you publish a week or a month or
So I'm trying to do one live and one published one a month.
a month? Okay. And tell us some of the guests and why people should listen to your podcast.
So I've had a lot of authors like Larry Indiviglia. I've had Allison Pilling.
Are they like, I'm not sure who they are.
Not necessarily big names. And that's part of my premise for my podcast, actually, is finding the extraordinary in the ordinary because we all have a story to share.
Yeah, that's why I
But
did
it,
this one on facing adversity moving forward, and I don't go after like big names, people that have a whole long list of followers, because it's the people like you and me, the everyday people, that everybody can help people see that everybody has a story to share.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's in connecting and sharing our stories that we both give and receive.
Mhm.
And it goes both ways. Like
Mhm.
I gain so much every single episode of my
Me
podcast. I
too.
gain
Yeah.
so many insights and I just want to share that with others and give people a place to reap those gifts, those nuggets.
Because when you share your story, and then others comment and stuff, you don't feel alone. And
Exactly.
somebody else listening will be like, oh, I could start a podcast, or, oh, maybe I want to be a grief coach because I can help people. And that's an area, a way that I like to help people with that. So what are the other steps? So once you recognize your grief, what's the next step?
The next step is on my website is a 6-step process. It's 6-step journey. I'm going to actually break it down into only 3 steps
Okay.
so that it's simpler.
Okay.
So the first step is recognizing your grief. The second step is experiencing your grief. And then the third step is transforming your grief and building a relationship with it.
What do you mean by experiencing it?
Learning how you experience grief individually and what that looks like for you. What lessons are you learning from your grief? How is this grief showing you that you're weaker than you thought you were? How is this grief showing you that you're stronger than you thought you were?
I know that for me, with staying, here's an example, with staying busy, I didn't really feel that much. And then I wanted to learn to feel more. And that's one of the reasons I retired. I just wanted to get more in touch with my feelings. And then Bruce passed away. And then I was feeling a lot. And it was uncomfortable to be crying and to be alone and to sit with my feelings. And there were times when I was like, I want to just turn on Netflix, or somebody else might eat. So it's important, I think, to be aware of what you're thinking. Or maybe I'm just going to scroll on my phone, right? I don't have to deal with it. So how are we avoiding our fear? I mean, our grief is something to really pay attention to, because if you don't feel it, then you're not going to get to that next stage, right?
Yeah, there's no magic pills with grief. So you can't take something and have it magically go away. It doesn't work like that. And it also doesn't go away.
It doesn't ever. It doesn't. It just
It
pops
changes
up.
over time. It changes with you. You learn from it. You can grow from it. You can build a relationship with it. But it's always there, like a scar.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, like a scar. It might fade a little bit, but it's there. So so the next step is transform it, right? What do you mean by that?
That's where we go into the grief and the gratitude. We learn to see grief as a mentor. We learn to be grateful for the lessons that it's teaching us. We learn through experiencing it, we learn, okay, now when grief comes again, I know, hello, grief. I've met you before. I know how my body reacts to you. I know what I need to express the grief. And I know that I can learn something from you. So let's go on this journey together.
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes it takes a little time and space, but it's important to look at the gift or the opportunity that came of. So one of the things I can find in the gift and the opportunity from my kid's father dying is, I mean, I'm not saying I would wish it on anybody, but just it is that they both appreciate life more and living in the moment. And that's something that, and me, I do too. That's the whole reason I created the Onward movement, which is all about embracing authenticity, releasing the fear of judgment, so you can create the life of your dreams with confidence. Because I think too many times we're like, well, when this happens, my life will get better. When that happens, my life will get better. When this happens, I'll be able to enjoy things. And no, we really need to enjoy being in the moment and not wish our life away. And that's something that I'm grateful for, that we all learned from his passing. And I learned to slow down, and I learned to feel my feelings.
That's one of the biggest lessons I think that working in the end of life field has taught me, is that the next day is not a guarantee. We can't, yes, the sun will come up, but there's no guarantee that we will rise with the sun.
Yeah.
And so it's a motivator for me to live in the moment, to cherish everyday things, to feel, to live life fully and connect with people. And
Yeah.
sometimes I even do it.
Oh, you're doing it now. Do you work with people from around the world or just in the United States?
I have worked with people from around the world.
So is there a difference in cultures with respect to grief that you've noticed?
Some cultures do it really, really well, but largely not really.
Interesting.
There are pockets. of cultures that really get grief, and they experience grief as a community. And so when grief comes, it brings the community together, and they all work and hold space for that grief as a community. Unfortunately, that's not common.
Yeah, not common. So here's a question. I went and saw my one of the reasons I retired at 50, not 56, is I wanted to spend more time with my parents. And so my mom is 78. She's in great shape and everything. My dad is 86 and a half. He'll be 87 in January. And when about 4 years ago, he fell down the steps and broke his tibia. And since that happened, and he had to sit in a chair for a long time, but I don't think he's listening, or my mom. But anyway, he's kind of gone downhill a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're 80, almost 87, you're getting older. And so I can see him getting older. How do I prepare for the grief?
What feels good to you?
Just really, that's a good question. Just really being in the moment with him. Like today, I went over there and he wanted to talk, but I had a meeting it was like 12:30. So I spent a half an hour with him, and I only live like an hour, a mile or two away. But then I had a meeting at 2, and then one at 3, and one at 3:30. And I want to create more time in my schedule where I'm really able to be there with him and have that time, because I don't want to regret and be feeling like, well, Emily, you retired so you could spend some time with him, and then you got so busy doing your podcast and coaching that you didn't have time for him again. So that's not,
Yeah.
I do spend time with him, but I could do more. So I think that's one way of preparing.
In my coaching training, this is more for when they're actually, no, it's not. So we were taught it as part of preparing for dying. And there are 5 things, like 5 most important things that you can say to your people. One is thank you. Thank you for the things you've done for me, for who you are, whatever that thank you list for looks like for you. The next one is I'm sorry and or please forgive me. Number 3 is I forgive you.
I showed that. I feel I'm proud of myself because I showed that to my former husband. He was paralyzed in both arms, and I spent a lot of time helping take care of him despite everything that had happened. And I'm proud of that. Yeah.
That's amazing. So number 4 is I love you. And the final one, number 5, is goodbye. And the origin of goodbye is actually God be with ye. So whether that's 5 minutes or a day or longer, we can say goodbye.
We need to really, even now as we're younger, like I'm thinking about, I have a basketball coach, a guy that coached me at basketball, and he's probably, a little younger than my dad. And you find yourself saying, yeah, we'll get together soon, or stuff like that. And I need to reach out to him, even write him a letter, because I was going through some of my stuff and I saw that he had written a letter that recommending me to go to the Naval Academy. So I had forgotten about that. And it was so nice of him to do. And you can, as you're an adult now, you can look back and say he was busy. He was raising his own kids. He was a basketball coach. He was teaching driver's ed. He was doing all these things, yet he took time to write a letter for me.
That's amazing.
So I want to thank him for that.
Yeah.
So I want to write to the counselor the psychologist, I think it was, that helped my son when we got a divorce, helped my kids. And I want to let him know, his name is Dr. Cecil Harris. I want to let him know how well my kids are doing. So it's those things that we think, I'll get to it tomorrow or whatever, and do it now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm coaching somebody who's 87. And I can tell what's on his mind, that you're not going to live to 120 or something. That.
Right.
And there's some relationships that he wants to fix, and he's going about doing. That's what's on his mind right now. And I admire that. Someone might say, well, what's an 87-year-old doing getting coaching? I really admire that about him, that he's really thinking about how he wants to feel on that day. I think we all should, because I saw Bruce die with regrets. We all should think about What are we really going to be thinking and feeling when we're laying in bed and taking our last breaths? Are we going to wish that we had stayed at work longer?
I'm guessing probably not.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that it'll be about our relationships, our connections, how we lived our life, and what we did with the time that we were given.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you've learned as a grief coach about grief, about yourself?
Grief has taught me so much. When I first started supporting people in grief, I didn't really know who I was. I was living by everybody else's expectations.
Oh, that sounds familiar. Yep.
And as I started supporting people in grief, when I understood that this is part of who I am, this ability to see both the grief and the gratitude, the ability to see that grief and death are part of life in a natural way. I was able to see that this is one of my life missions is to help people, accompany people in their journey back home, wherever home is, to be a travel buddy, a travel companion. And it's taught me supporting people in their grief journeys has taught me more about how I feel about grief, how I experience grief, how I express grief. And it's taught me to do as I'm asking my clients to do, look for those lessons. How is this experience teaching me, benefiting me, growing me?
Yeah. Have you had someone close to you pass away?
So I don't have any remaining grandparents. All of my grandparents are dead. In my high school class, we've had probably 20 or 30, maybe even more of our high school class die. And we graduated in the class of 99. So I'm not old. And each time it reminds me that we don't have a guarantee on life and the importance of the relationships again.
Yeah.
Have I experienced the death of someone to affect me in my everyday routines? Not yet.
Mhm.
Will it come? Absolutely. I don't know when, but it will come.
Let's see what Eileen said. Eileen said, "Thank you for this podcast. I lost my dad when I was 28, my mom at age 42, my brother just last year, and in the last year, both my kitties, one just last week. And like you said, hello, grief, and I embrace it. And I'm totally grateful for the love they brought into my life."
That's
Thanks for
beautiful.
sharing that, Eileen. And then she said, "In my grief, I have it fully unapologetic and consider it to be the bass notes on a piano. It shows us the depth of how much we love." That's for sure. That's for sure. I mean, I would share here, this is my dog. And I've had one dog die, and I'm so close to this dog that I can't even think about it. But she's just always around me, telling me to get off the computer, telling me to do stuff, take her for a walk. And when she goes, I know it's going to be really hard.
Yeah.
And she looks me right in the eyes. I feel like how people get with their pets. You feel like they're just seeing right into your soul. So her name is
Yeah.
Pearl. And I don't know, sometimes it seems like with pets, you can't even really, I guess we can talk to them, but like I can talk to my dad and I can have communication with him. But I know there are people who can talk to pets. They say they can. I don't know.
That's not a gift that I have.
Yeah, I feel like I know what she's saying to me, but I don't know for sure. I definitely know when she's saying, "Pay attention to me." So what workshops do you have? It looks like too you're working with grief workers with COVID, through COVID, right? Because you've got some workshops for them, I think I saw on your website.
So I have 2 recurring workshops. One is the second Saturday of the month, and that one is designed for compassion fatigue and burnout. And it's talking about the stress, the burnout, the grief, and exploring tips for self-care. The other one is called What to Do When You Don't Do Grief. And that in that one, we talk about how many sources there are of grief. Like we've been talking today, it's
Mhm.
not just death, it's our pets, it's our trauma, it's our job losses, it's COVID, it's so many different sources. So recognizing the grief and then exploring ways that we process grief, ways that we express or mourn. And it's not just emotional. It can be physical as well, like going for a jog or making a collage. It can be cognitive, learning about a new subject, understanding all of the medical notes so that you can try and make some kind of meaning from what happened. A lot of times when we hear grief, it's accompanied by the emotional expression of grief. But that's not the way that everybody grieves. And so the point of what to do when you don't do grief is building the awareness that we are individual. We do grieve in different ways, and that's okay. It's learning and exploring our own way of grieving and also respecting the way that others grieve.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can imagine in a family, you've got brothers and sisters or kids, and they're all kind of grieving differently. And perhaps we can judge and say, "Well, you're not crying as much as me," or "I missed a month of work and you went right back." And how can that be? And recognizing that everyone grieves differently, and not to judge. We're
Hmm.
take care of ourselves. How
Yeah,
do you handle compassion fatigue? Do you ever get it?
I get it. I do get it. And it's funny because it usually ends up right around the time that I'm doing my workshop. So it's a good reminder for me too. Oh, yeah, I got to take care of myself. I have to implement these self care tools. Some signs that I am facing burnout is I'm quicker to tears. I'm feeling overwhelmed and more easily irritated, feeling like I have to solve everybody's problems. And that's not my role. I'm getting better about recognizing, oh yeah, it's that burnout thing. Time to take a break. Time to put stuff down. And I schedule a creative day in the middle of the day. I mean middle of the week.
That's a good idea.
So I try and put work down, or at least my normal work stuff. I try and put it down and do something different. And then once a month I schedule a me day.
What do you do on your me day? You said that was once a month? Uh-huh.
Yeah, it depends. Sometimes I take a nap. Often I take a nap. Sometimes I'll go on a new walk or a hike. Sometimes I will talk with a friend.
You wanted to talk about you are exactly where you need to be right now. That's interesting because sometimes we're like, well, I'm not doing this enough. I'm not doing that enough. I'm not grieving right. How do we know that we're exactly where we need to be right now?
I think it takes a lot of trust.
Answer.
Trust in trust in our experiences that we've had that got us to this point. Trust that they were tailored exactly for us to mold us into the people that we are now. Trust that our souls, our bodies know what they need and listening to them and trusting them, and trusting the future that the experiences that we're having now will continue to mold us into the people that we're destined to become or that we can become, however resonates with you.
This is your website,
Yes.
grievingcoach.com. And that's interesting. You got that. You just started like 4 years ago and you got that URL. That's pretty cool, huh? I
It
bet you're like, how can there not be a grievingcoach.com?
that was actually an amazing story because the weekend before I got that website, I was talking with some friends about being an entrepreneur,
Mhm.
and I had never imagined myself in the business world at all. And afterwards I was talking with one of my friends and I thought, what do I even have to offer? And she's like, duh, your view on death, grief.
So Bible, it's that others can see in us what we can't see in ourselves.
Yeah. And that's what my grief work has shown me. It's shown me who I am and these talents that I have as a grief worker. And it's helping me blossom in ways that I never thought I would.
That's awesome. Like, what's some examples of ways that you never thought you would?
Talking with other people on their podcast shows, I never thought that I would do that. Every single elementary school teacher commented, "She's such a good student. I wish she would talk more." Every single one of them. I was so shy and reserved, and I still am in a lot of ways.
We're like, I
Space,
never thought I'd be on a podcast after all those. When hosting my own podcast, it's intimidating when you host your own podcast. If you do a solo cast where it's just you, you're not talking to anybody. It's intimidating to be speaking to a mic and not know who's listening. Yeah, that's awesome. I can see you light up when you talk about that. So then you went and looked at Grieving Coach. You're like, wow, no one has that URL.
yeah, and I got it, and
You
here
were
I
meant,
am.
it
Like,
was meant to be. And
yeah,
then you've got a Facebook. That's a group, or is that just you
that's
on,
my business.
your business page on Facebook? And then I'm
Yeah.
sharing your LinkedIn, and I'll put all of these in the show notes too. But on LinkedIn, we are connected. And then you have a letsreimagine.org. What's that?
So Reimagine is actually a nonprofit organization that I
Okay.
do a lot of work with, and I have an organizational profile, a public profile on Reimagine. Again, it's
I
Grieving
see.
Coach.
Mhm.
And so I do all of my workshops. I do my live podcasts on the Reimagine stage. They are an incredible organization that talks about tough conversations, tough topics like end of life, grief, trauma, social injustice.
Yeah, that we don't talk about end of life a lot.
We don't.
When really, like I was talking to somebody earlier today that's going to be on my podcast in March. Her son committed suicide, Logan, I think in 2010 or 12. And she calls it transition. He transitioned then. And it's like we talk about so many other things. I don't know, movie stars and what movie you saw, and like I have the best car and need to have a big house. And we don't talk about death. It's like we act like if we don't talk about it, it's not going to happen. So,
Yeah, so Reimagine is an amazing space where these conversations happen.
wow. That's awesome. The other one I have to show here has your phone number on it. You gave it to me. Do you want that? Your
That's fine.
arcade
That's
number?
phone number.
Okay. So Jen, JENN at grievingcoach.com. And then there's your phone number. People can what? Call or text or what? Either one?
Text is preferable actually
Okay.
because my phone is sometimes sometimes I'm working with my kids, sometimes I'm not available always to pick it up.
Well, with 5 kids, I guess you're a little busy, huh? Okay. And then let's see. We have a couple more comments here. Okay. Eileen. Right now, with the loss of my kitty, I have it fully and let the wave come over, and it's going to be a while. Where you don't see him in the corner. Oh my God, I can't even think about it, Eileen. Like Pearl is always around me and she sleeps with me. And I'm sorry, Eileen. I know that's really hard. Yeah.
And that's one of the best things that we can do is just let the waves come because
It's-
they always recede.
So I really enjoyed interviewing you. I'm glad that you were able to get on. I know we had a
Me
glitch
too.
at the beginning, but it worked out great. And I appreciate this interview, and I know it's going to help so many people to hear it. I guess one other question I would have is when somebody's grieving, and what are some good things to say to them? Like, let me ask this. I know how you feel. Is that a good thing to say?
It can be.
Can
It
be.
can also be very irritating
Yeah.
because we don't know their relationship, we don't know their experiences, we don't know their feelings.
So what can we best do when somebody that we know is grieving and hurting, like Eileen with her kitty and stuff? How can we best support them?
I hear you, I see you, I support you. And sometimes that is the most precious gift that we can give.
Yeah. Eileen, we hear you. Thank you for what you do, because it's definitely, and I think too, as we baby boomers, near the end of the baby boomers, as we get old, there's so many people that are getting older in this country, and talking about it more and talking about death. I can just see it in my dad. Like, he's very careful about how he spends his time, because he knows, when I think we just take time for granted, right? But he's
Mm-hmm.
like, we go to a movie and he doesn't like it. He's like, oh, that was frustrating to him, because it was like 3 hours of when he could have been reading or whatever. I mean, he sees the limited time and he really wants to make sure he makes the best of it.
Yeah,
And I think when we're coming up, we just take it for granted. And it really is important to create a life, design a life that you love living now. Don't wait.
absolutely.
So I'm saying that I started doing it at 56, but I mean, I did love my life then, but there's some things I would have done differently. And I thought, well, I can't, because I've got to do this. But I think we need to, like, take another look at when we're saying I can't, because we need to really, is that really true? Is that a limiting belief? What if you could?
Mm-hmm.
What's a way you could have that life now? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and that's a
Thank you.
lesson that I've learned
Have you? Yeah, I'm sure.
in as a grief worker is coming up against my own limiting beliefs and recognizing them and working through them. So that's
Mhm.
a good point that you made.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah, you're welcome, Jenny. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. Thank you, Eileen, for sharing what you've been through lately. And my heart goes out to you for sure. And I appreciate everyone who tuned in tonight.
What a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for being my guest today, Jenny. I'm grateful for you. And I'm grateful for all of my Onward podcast listeners, the ones who tune in live when I stream it on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, and the ones that show up and download the podcast on their favorite podcast app and listen to it. I appreciate every single one of you. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. I can't believe it's already going to be 2022. You know, my coaching programs are filling up for 2022. I'm so excited because coaching is something I love doing. I love helping people create a life that they love living. I love it when my clients release limiting beliefs and realize, oh, I can have that in my life. I can do that. I can change my results in a way that I would like. When they have those experiences, it just brings so much joy to my heart. If you're interested in working with me, I put a link in the show notes for scheduling a conversation with me, even if you just want to talk and see if the coaching is right for you. I'd love to meet you, and I'd love to help you create a life that you love living. It doesn't mean that you don't love living your life right now. We're meant to continuously grow and expand. What dreams do you have for your future? If you can dream it, you can achieve it. If your mind is saying, nah, we've got this situation, it can't happen because of this and that, those are limiting beliefs. Let's talk about them. Let's move onward together. The Onward podcast is sponsored by my business, Emily Harmon Coaching and Consulting. I wish you all a wonderful holiday season. Thank you for listening.